In the suffocating, sun-scorched furnace of the North African desert in the brutal summer of 1941, the British Empire was violently, mathematically bleeding out on the sprawling, unforgiving sands. The brilliant, heavily mechanized German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary and terrifying Desert Fox, had aggressively smashed his elite Afrika Korps deep into the heart of Libya, ruthlessly pushing the exhausted, battle-hardened British forces all the way back toward the heavily fortified, claustrophobic borders of Egypt. The vital, strategic Allied garrison at Tobruk was entirely, suffocatingly besieged by fascist armor, and the once mighty Royal Air Force was desperately, agonizingly losing the apocalyptic war in the skies, completely unable to stop the relentless swarm of Axis aircraft launching from heavily guarded rear-area airstrips. The traditional, deeply fossilized and highly aristocratic British military command was entirely paralyzed, completely incapable of conceiving a tactical response to Rommel's mechanized brilliance, rigidly clinging to outdated doctrines while their men were systematically slaughtered in the sand. It would violently require a completely unconventional, profoundly rebellious, and deeply chaotic mind to permanently shatter the established rules of desert warfare and mathematically alter the catastrophic trajectory of the entire conflict. That profoundly dangerous, untamable mind belonged to a 25-year-old Scottish aristocrat named David Stirling. By all conventional, heavily bureaucratic military metrics, First Lieutenant Stirling was an absolute, unmitigated disaster of a soldier, a towering figure standing 6 feet 5 inches tall who possessed a deeply ingrained reputation for relentless insubordination, heavy drinking, and an absolute paralyzing disdain for the rigid hierarchy of the British Army. In the late sweltering summer of 1941, his chaotic, highly unpromising military career seemed entirely mathematically over when a highly experimental, deeply flawed parachute jump went catastrophically wrong, leaving him temporarily paralyzed with severe, agonizing spinal injuries. Confined to a claustrophobic, suffocating hospital bed in Cairo, completely unable to walk and staring blankly at the ceiling for weeks, Stirling was violently forced into a period of deep, intense psychological reflection. He meticulously, mathematically analyzed the massive, blood-soaked failures of traditional British commando raids, which relied on hundreds of men executing heavily coordinated, easily detected amphibious assaults that almost mathematically guaranteed catastrophic casualties and entirely compromised the vital element of surprise. In the quiet, agonizing isolation of his physical convalescence, Stirling violently birthed a revolutionary, deeply terrifying military doctrine that completely defied the established fossilized logic of total war. He mathematically concluded that the sprawling, featureless ocean of the North African desert was absolutely physically impossible to fully garrison, creating massive, invisible gaps in the Axis defensive lines. Instead of launching massive, clumsy battalions against heavily fortified, mechanized front lines, Stirling envisioned a microscopic, deeply lethal phantom force that would completely weaponize the terrifying vastness of the Sahara. He theorized that tiny, highly trained teams of 4 to 5 men could entirely bypass the brutal front lines, aggressively slipping hundreds of miles through the unguarded, freezing desert nights to violently strike Rommel's most vulnerable, highly valuable airfields in the deep rear. Once the devastating, mechanized sabotage was ruthlessly complete, these phantom raiders would instantly, flawlessly evaporate back into the suffocating abyss of the desert before the terrified enemy even realized they were under attack, creating an absolute, paralyzing psychological terror. But mathematically proving this brilliant, cold-blooded theory required convincing a deeply stubborn, highly aristocratic British High Command that openly despised him and fundamentally distrusted unconventional warfare. Stirling meticulously drafted a highly detailed, fiercely argued operational memorandum, outlining the absolute, undeniable strategic value of these deep penetration phantom raids and explicitly requesting the immediate authorization to recruit a microscopic, heavily specialized force of just under 70 men. The suffocating, undeniable problem was that Stirling was a junior officer, currently immobilized on crutches, with a widely known, deeply toxic reputation for insubordination and military failure. Handing his revolutionary, highly classified blueprint to his immediate fossilized superiors through the proper bureaucratic channels was mathematically guaranteed to result in the document being violently, permanently buried in a dark filing cabinet, dismissed as the delirious ramblings of an injured madman. If his terrifying vision of a desert phantom force was ever going to see the blood-stained sands of North Africa, Stirling knew with absolute certainty that he would have to execute a completely unauthorized, deeply audacious physical infiltration of his own military headquarters. The legendary, heavily romanticized account of what happened next remains one of the absolute most audacious, deeply rebellious moments in the entire sprawling history of the British military. Operating in agonizing pain on physical crutches and driven by an absolute unyielding determination, Stirling actively, aggressively bypassed the heavily armed sentries at the Middle East headquarters in Cairo, slipping beneath the perimeter fence like a common thief. Limping violently through the claustrophobic, bustling corridors, he aggressively barged directly into the private, highly secure office of Major General Neil Ritchie, the Deputy Chief of Staff, mere seconds before the furious military police could physically drag him out into the sweltering street. Desperately slamming his meticulously crafted memorandum onto the general's desk, Stirling executed a mathematically impossible gamble that violently changed history. Ritchie actually read the document, recognized the cold-blooded, undeniable strategic brilliance of the phantom proposal, and aggressively championed the idea to General Claude Auchinleck, who was currently under terrifying, suffocating pressure from Winston Churchill to violently strike back at Rommel, instantly authorizing the creation of the most lethal special forces unit the world had ever seen. Within days of that terrifying, highly unauthorized physical infiltration of the Middle East headquarters, General Claude Auchinleck officially, mathematically authorized David Stirling's audacious, blood-soaked gamble. Auchinleck immediately promoted the deeply rebellious aristocrat to captain, granting him the absolute, unmitigated permission to aggressively recruit a microscopic force of 6 officers and 60 men. However, the official military designation of this newly birthed unit was a brilliant, deeply cynical masterpiece of geopolitical deception engineered by the highest echelons of command. British intelligence was currently running a massive, highly classified psychological operation designed to violently trick Rommel's Afrika Corps into believing a colossal 5,000-man British airborne brigade was actively operating in the sprawling desert. To mathematically anchor this sprawling, terrifying illusion in reality, Stirling's tiny 60-man unit was officially designated L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade. This explicitly falsely implied the terrifying existence of heavily armed detachments A through K, completely fooling Axis intelligence into aggressively, mathematically diverting precious frontline combat troops away from the actual fighting to physically guard against a colossal parachute threat that absolutely, undeniably did not exist. But while the absolute highest echelons of the British command structure had officially authorized the creation of the SAS, the deeply resentful, fossilized middle management of the military bureaucracy violently, aggressively attempted to strangle the infant unit in its cradle. Staff officers stationed in the claustrophobic, highly secure headquarters of Cairo actively, mathematically wanted Stirling to fail, deeply terrified that this highly irregular, completely undisciplined band of misfits would permanently disrupt the sacred aristocratic order of the traditional British Army. These vindictive, suit-wearing bureaucrats aggressively denied the SAS basic, vital military supplies, violently refused to issue them functional transport vehicles, and deliberately, maliciously assigned them to a desolate, entirely abandoned stretch of freezing sand near the Great Bitter Lake called Cabrit. They mathematically calculated that by entirely starving the unit of fundamental resources, the highly romanticized phantom force would violently collapse under the suffocating weight of the Sahara, perfectly mathematically vindicating their fierce opposition and permanently preventing any future unconventional units from challenging their fossilized authority. Faced with the absolute, terrifying reality of their complete logistical abandonment, the highly resourceful, deeply defiant men of the SAS violently resorted to the absolute most primal tactic of survival: outright, heavily orchestrated theft. In their very first, completely unofficial nighttime operation, Stirling's desperate men aggressively raided a heavily supplied, heavily guarded New Zealand military encampment situated miles across the freezing desert. Operating under the pitch-black cover of darkness, the Phantom Raiders violently, systematically stole massive canvas tents, essential cold-weather bedding, critical field rations, and even a heavy, completely unnecessary wooden piano to mathematically establish the physical infrastructure of their entirely unfunded desert headquarters. This deeply audacious, highly illegal nighttime raid perfectly, mathematically demonstrated the absolute, unyielding ethos of the SAS. They would completely ignore the suffocating, heavily regulated rules of the British Empire, aggressively taking whatever physical resources they mathematically required to violently execute their mission and survive the apocalyptic conditions of the North African theatre. Despite the terrifying, suffocating lack of official logistical support and the actively hostile bureaucratic environment, Stirling aggressively, meticulously recruited an incredibly unique, highly dangerous collection of military misfits to fill the ranks of L Detachment. He actively, relentlessly sought out combat-hardened, deeply traumatized veterans from recently disbanded commando units like Lay Force, fiercely independent, highly aggressive soldiers who had been violently rejected by regular infantry battalions for their deeply rebellious nature and inherent, unmitigated aggression. These were men who possessed a cold-blooded, absolute willingness to volunteer for highly classified, mathematically suicidal missions deep behind enemy lines with absolutely zero promise of medical evacuation or physical rescue. They were not seeking glorious, highly polished medals or public recognition from the aristocratic generals in London. They were seeking the absolute, unmitigated thrill of unleashing calculated, devastating violence against the mechanized fascist war machine, violently transforming their deep-seated insubordination into a highly lethal, mathematically perfect weapon of asymmetric warfare. But to physically, mathematically mold this chaotic, highly aggressive band of thieves, brawlers, and rebels into the most lethal, highly disciplined phantom force in modern military history, Stirling desperately, aggressively needed a true tactical genius. While David Stirling undeniably possessed the brilliant, audacious political vision necessary to keep the fragile unit alive against the suffocating, vindictive bureaucracy of Cairo, he mathematically lacked the rigorous, methodical discipline required to physically prepare the men for the terrifying abyss of the desert. The absolute, cold-blooded tactical architecture of the early SAS would have to be meticulously engineered by a completely different man, a highly educated, fiercely disciplined intellectual named First Lieutenant Jock Lewes. Lewes was about to aggressively design an absolutely grueling, terrifying training regimen in the unforgiving furnace of the Kabrit camp, violently pushing the deeply stubborn recruits to the absolute physical and psychological brink, and ingeniously engineering the terrifying, highly explosive devices that would soon mathematically incinerate the pride of the German Luftwaffe. While David Stirling undeniably possessed the brilliant, audacious political vision necessary to keep the fragile unit alive against the suffocating, vindictive bureaucracy of Cairo, he mathematically lacked the rigorous, methodical discipline required to physically prepare the men for the terrifying abyss of the desert. The absolute, cold-blooded tactical architecture of the early SAS had to be meticulously engineered by a completely different man, a highly educated, fiercely disciplined intellectual named First Lieutenant Jock Lewes. Lewes, a former Oxford University rower, was the absolute, mathematical soul of the Phantom Force, aggressively designing an absolutely grueling, terrifying training regimen in the unforgiving, sun-scorched furnace of the Kabrit camp. He violently pushed the deeply stubborn, rebellious recruits to the absolute physical and psychological brink, meticulously teaching them advanced celestial navigation, ruthless desert survival, and silent, highly lethal killing techniques. Lewes explicitly, mathematically ensured that every single operator was entirely cross-trained in every operational discipline, so the Phantom unit could seamlessly, flawlessly continue its devastating mission even if half the raiding team was violently slaughtered in the pitch-black darkness. But Lewes's absolute greatest, most terrifying contribution to the Allied war effort was a deeply destructive, highly specialized piece of explosive engineering that mathematically changed the course of the desert campaign. The SAS operators had mathematically realized that standard military demolition charges were catastrophically, dangerously inadequate for their highly specific sabotage mission. Regular explosives would violently blow a physical hole in the aluminum fuselage of an Axis aircraft, but the highly efficient German mechanics could often repair the damage in a matter of mere days. The SAS absolutely, undeniably, required a microscopic, highly portable weapon that would violently detonate and immediately unleash an unquenchable apocalyptic inferno. After weeks of dangerous, highly volatile experimentation in the freezing desert nights, the legendary Lewes bomb was violently born. Lewes ingeniously, meticulously combined highly flammable thermite with modern C4 plastic explosive, adding a sticky mixture of diesel oil and a highly reliable 30-second time delay fuse. Weighing barely a pound, a single phantom operator could carry dozens of these devastating C4 devices, mathematically guaranteeing the total, unrecognizable incineration of every single parked aircraft they physically touched. If First Lieutenant Jock Lewes was the brilliant mathematical intellect of the infant unit, its absolute, unmitigated physical fury was completely embodied by a colossal, fiercely aggressive Irishman named Paddy Mayne. Standing 6 feet 3 inches tall and built like a terrifying, impenetrable brick wall, Mayne was a former international rugby champion who possessed a deeply legendary, highly explosive, and incredibly dangerous temper. The fiercely independent brawler was officially recruited into the ranks of the SAS while sitting in a claustrophobic, heavily guarded military prison cell, aggressively awaiting a violent court-martial for physically striking his own commanding officer in a drunken rage. Stirling instantly recognized the absolute, raw, terrifying combat potential in the imprisoned giant, explicitly offering him a highly dangerous, blood-soaked path to military redemption rather than a dishonorable discharge. Mayne possessed an almost psychopathic, deeply unsettling calmness under heavy, suppressing enemy fire, operating in the chaotic, blood-stained darkness of a midnight raid, with a cold-blooded, mechanical precision that would soon make him the absolute most feared commando in the entire North African theater. By the suffocating, freezing nights of November 1941, this deeply terrifying, highly unconventional military trinity, Stirling the visionary aristocrat, Lewes the intellectual architect, and Mayne the brutal executioner, had successfully, mathematically transformed their chaotic band of rebellious misfits into a highly coiled, fully lethal weapon. They possessed the revolutionary tactical doctrines, they possessed the devastating, deeply engineered C4 explosives, and they harbored an absolute, suffocating hunger to violently prove their fossilized British military critics entirely wrong. The operational stage was officially, mathematically set for Operation Squatter, the highly anticipated, deeply classified inaugural mission that would finally, aggressively unleash the SAS into the sprawling, heavily guarded rear echelons of Rommel's supposedly invincible Afrika Korps. The aristocratic generals in Cairo silently, gleefully waited for the entire experiment to violently collapse, completely convinced that these undisciplined ghosts would simply be swallowed by the merciless Sahara. But the brutal, completely unforgiving reality of deep desert warfare was about to violently, aggressively remind the heavily armed phantom raiders that brilliant mathematical theories drafted on paper rarely survive catastrophic physical contact with the terrifying, chaotic abyss of the Sahara. Operation Squatter was aggressively designed to be a brilliant, devastating airborne decapitation strike, requiring 55 heavily loaded operators to parachute directly into the freezing darkness near 5 heavily guarded Axis airfields. However, mere hours before the heavily laden transport aircraft were mathematically scheduled to lift off the runway, the deeply panicked meteorological reports delivered a terrifying, mathematically impossible reality. Massive, apocalyptic gale-force winds were violently sweeping across the designated drop zones, completely obliterating the absolute maximum safe limits for a military parachute jump. Faced with the agonizing, profoundly terrifying decision to either mathematically abort the mission and face permanent disbandment or jump directly into a blinding, suffocating wall of flying sand, Stirling aggressively, fatefully, ordered his men into the aircraft, violently initiating one of the most catastrophic, physically devastating airborne drops of the entire Second World War. On the pitch-black, deeply terrifying night of November 16, 1941, the highly anticipated, heavily classified combat debut of the SAS was violently launched in direct mathematical support of Operation Crusader, a massive British offensive designed to aggressively relieve the besieged garrison at Tobruk. Operation Squatter was meticulously, mathematically designed by David Stirling to be a brilliant, devastating airborne decapitation strike. 55 heavily armed Phantom operators, completely loaded down with their experimental C4 explosives and submachine guns, were explicitly ordered to parachute directly into the freezing darkness near 5 heavily guarded Axis airfields at Gazala and Timimi. Their cold-blooded mission was to systematically, violently incinerate dozens of parked aircraft, then execute an exhausting, heavily armed 50-mile march directly across the open desert to rendezvous with an extraction patrol from the long-range desert group. It was a sprawling, deeply complex logistical gamble, and the absolute, unrelenting fury of nature was about to violently transform it into an unmitigated, blood-soaked nightmare. Hours before the heavily loaded Bristol-Bombay transport aircraft even lifted off the runway, the deeply panicked meteorological reports delivered a terrifying, mathematically impossible reality. Massive, apocalyptic gale-force winds of over 30 knots were violently sweeping across the designated drop zones, more than double the absolute maximum safe limit for a military parachute jump. First Lieutenant David Stirling faced an agonizing, profoundly terrifying command decision. If he mathematically aborted the mission, the deeply hostile fossilized British staff officers in Cairo would immediately gleefully use the cancellation to permanently violently disband his highly controversial unit before it ever saw combat. Believing completely in the physical resilience of his battle-hardened men, Stirling made the highly controversial, deeply fateful decision to aggressively proceed directly into the teeth of the storm, violently committing the infant SAS to the absolute unforgiving mercy of the Sahara. As the heavy transport aircraft violently shuddered over the freezing Libyan desert, the screaming, gale-force winds aggressively tore into the formations, initiating one of the most catastrophic, physically devastating airborne drops of the entire Second World War. The heavily burdened men violently threw themselves out of the metal doors into a blinding, suffocating wall of flying sand, instantly losing all mathematical cohesion in the pitch-black abyss. The apocalyptic winds aggressively scattered the terrified paratroopers across dozens of miles of freezing, unforgiving desert. Men violently slammed into the rocky earth at terrifying speeds, suffering agonizing broken limbs, severe concussions, and catastrophic spinal injuries upon impact. The vital equipment containers holding their precious C4 explosives, extra ammunition, and vital drinking water were violently ripped away by the storm, permanently, mathematically lost in the sprawling darkness, entirely stripping the saboteurs of their highly engineered fangs. The absolute, terrifying violence of the massive sandstorm completely, mathematically destroyed the entire operational structure of the raid before a single shot was ever fired. One of the transport aircraft, entirely blinded by the suffocating dust and violently blown off course, was aggressively intercepted and completely obliterated by a roaming German Messerschmitt night fighter, instantly incinerating an entire squad of highly trained Phantoms. For the deeply traumatized, physically shattered survivors who actually made it to the ground, the glorious, highly mathematical mission was instantly transformed into a desperate, terrifying struggle for fundamental physical survival. Entirely deprived of their Lewis bombs and violently separated from their commanding officers, the scattered squads found themselves hopelessly, suffocatingly lost in the freezing dunes, mathematically incapable of reaching the heavily guarded Axis airfields before the rising sun would completely expose them to enemy patrols. When the freezing, blood-tinged dawn finally broke over the vast, uncaring Sahara, the absolute, unmitigated scale of the disaster became painfully, undeniably clear. Not a single enemy aircraft had been successfully sabotaged. Not a single C4 device had detonated on an Axis runway. Out of the original 55 fiercely proud men who had bravely jumped into the darkness, a staggering, deeply terrifying total of only 21 exhausted, physically broken survivors miraculously staggered their way through the burning heat to the designated long-range desert group rendezvous point over the next several agonizing days. The rest of the Phantom unit was dead, captured, or permanently swallowed by the unforgiving sands. Operation Squatter was an absolute, undeniable, mathematically perfect failure. The fossilized British generals in Cairo aggressively prepared the official paperwork to violently terminate the SAS experiment, fully believing that David Stirling's reckless, highly romanticized theories had been permanently, rightfully buried in the desert, completely unaware that the surviving Phantom was already plotting his next blood-soaked resurrection. As the deeply traumatized, physically shattered survivors of the catastrophic Squatter disaster were slowly, agonizingly driven back to friendly lines, First Lieutenant David Stirling absolutely refused to succumb to the suffocating weight of military failure. Staring out the window of the heavily armed Chevrolet transport trucks that had miraculously rescued his bleeding men, a new, entirely revolutionary tactical epiphany violently struck the young commander. The parachute insertion had mathematically failed because they were entirely, catastrophically, at the absolute, unpredictable mercy of the violent desert weather. But the highly skilled, deeply respected men of the Long-Range Desert Group, LRDG, had just successfully, seamlessly navigated hundreds of miles of treacherous, heavily patrolled enemy territory entirely on the ground to physically extract them. If the LRDG's massive, reliable trucks could safely pull them out of the abyss, they could absolutely, mathematically deliver the SAS directly to the very edge of their targets, completely bypassing the catastrophic risks of jumping out of blinded airplanes. In the freezing, unforgiving December of 1941, Stirling aggressively formed a highly classified, deeply symbiotic tactical partnership with the LRDG, cynically utilizing their battle-hardened navigators as a highly lethal, mechanized desert taxi service. This brilliant, completely unauthorized logistical pivot mathematically resurrected the infant SAS from the ashes of absolute defeat, essentially piggybacking on the hard-earned navigation skills of the older unit. Transported silently through the freezing nights to within a few miles of the Axis airfields in the heavy British and American-made trucks, the Phantom operators would dismount from the vehicles and aggressively execute the final, deadly infiltration entirely on foot. The absolute, terrifying validation of Stirling's original heavily criticized doctrine finally occurred at the sprawling, heavily guarded Tammet Airfield, proving that a handful of men could inflict more damage than an entire conventional brigade. Blair Paddy Mayne and his tiny, heavily armed squad aggressively breached the Tammet perimeter in total pitch-black darkness, entirely undetected by the freezing Axis sentries. In a terrifying, cold-blooded display of unmitigated physical violence, the colossal Irishman violently burst into an enemy officer's mess hall that was still brightly lit and occupied. Operating with an absolute psychopathic calmness, Mayne aggressively emptied his submachine gun into the terrified Axis pilots and ground crews, instantly transforming the room into a blood-soaked slaughterhouse. He ruthlessly eliminated the immediate threat with absolute mechanical precision, before casually walking out onto the freezing tarmac to execute the primary sabotage mission, leaving a trail of absolute devastation in his wake. Moving systematically through the perfectly aligned rows of highly valuable Axis aircraft, Mayne aggressively planted his highly engineered C-4 charges on a squadron of parked Junkers Ju-52 dive bombers. The terrifying percussive detonations violently shattered the desert night, entirely obliterating 24 aircraft in a massive apocalyptic inferno of aviation fuel and twisted aluminum without the SAS losing a single man. This massive, mathematically impossible success violently detonated a tidal wave of highly calculated, deeply devastating Phantom raids across Rommel's vulnerable rear lines, aggressively forcing the deeply paranoid Axis commanders to mathematically reallocate thousands of frontline combat troops to physically guard their burning airstrips, exactly as Stirling had predicted. But the staggering, heavily romanticized success of the bloody winter campaign came with a terrifying, agonizingly high blood price for the Phantom Raiders. In late December, The brilliant, deeply respected architect of the force, First Lieutenant Jock Lewes, was violently killed when his LRDG transport convoy was aggressively strafed by a marauding German fighter plane. His femoral artery violently severed by a 20mm cannon shell, Lewes bled to death in the freezing sand in a matter of agonizing minutes, deeply traumatizing the men who had worshipped his tactical genius. Yet the terrifying, highly mechanized system he had meticulously built absolutely refused to die, as the surviving raiders violently harnessed their grief into an unyielding, apocalyptic rage, mathematically preparing to evolve their tactics away from the LRDG trucks and into their own fleet of highly customized American machines. By the sweltering, heavily contested summer of 1942, First Lieutenant David Stirling mathematically recognized a deeply frustrating, suffocating logistical bottleneck that threatened to permanently paralyze his phantom operations. The SAS was entirely, fundamentally dependent on the massive, slow-moving Chevrolet trucks of the long-range desert group for deep desert transportation. While the LRDG were undeniably the absolute, undisputed masters of celestial navigation, their primary, highly classified operational directive was long-range intelligence gathering, not violently delivering heavily armed saboteurs into the teeth of heavily fortified enemy fire. Stirling aggressively, ruthlessly demanded total, unmitigated operational independence, mathematically realizing he required a fast, highly maneuverable, and incredibly durable vehicle that his own men could aggressively drive directly onto the Axis airfields. The absolute perfect mechanical answer did not come from the brilliant engineers in London. It came entirely from a sprawling, highly industrialized manufacturing plant in Toledo, Ohio, violently arriving in North Africa in the completely unassuming form of the American Willys Jeep. Under the hood, the newly arrived Willys Jeep boasted a roaring, incredibly powerful American V8 engine that mathematically provided unprecedented, highly aggressive horsepower across the deep, unforgiving sand dunes. But a standard factory-issue utility Jeep was completely catastrophically unsuited for deep penetration combat operations behind enemy lines. The highly resourceful, deeply ingenious mechanics of the SAS aggressively, meticulously transformed these unassuming American vehicles into terrifying, heavily modified machines of apocalyptic destruction. They violently stripped away the heavy glass windshields, the metal doors, and the canvas roofs to mathematically reduce the overall weight, aggressively welding heavy steel racks to the exterior to carry dozens of jerry cans filled with vital aviation fuel and drinking water. This massive, heavily engineered expansion of their logistical footprint mathematically pushed the operational range of the V8 Jeeps to over 400 grueling miles, explicitly allowing the Phantom Raiders to violently strike targets that Rommel believed were absolutely, mathematically untouchable. But the true, unmitigated terror of the highly customized SAS Jeep was derived entirely from its aggressive, heavily excessive offensive armament. Drawing from surplus Royal Air Force aviation supplies, the Phantom operators violently bolted twin-mounted Vickers K machine guns to the front passenger side and the rear swivel mounts of the vehicles. These deeply terrifying rapid-fire aviation weapons, fed entirely by 100-round flat drum clips, possessed a mathematically astonishing, highly destructive rate of fire of over 1,000 rounds per minute. Unlike standard infantry weapons that jammed catastrophically and permanently in the blinding, suffocating sand, the incredibly resilient, low-friction locking mechanisms of the Vickers K fired flawlessly even when completely coated in the abrasive desert dust. Loaded with a highly lethal, alternating mixture of armor-piercing, glowing tracer and devastating incendiary ammunition, a single heavily armed Jeep could violently unleash an apocalyptic, blinding wall of lead entirely capable of physically tearing the metal wings off a parked bomber in a matter of agonizing seconds. With their newly engineered, heavily armed mechanical cavalry finally perfected, First Lieutenant David Stirling violently, permanently abandoned the quiet, stealthy foot infiltrations of the previous winter campaign. The tactical evolution was mathematically staggering and deeply terrifying for the Axis defenders. Why painstakingly, dangerously sneak onto an active airfield for hours to plant timed C4 explosives when you could simply violently smash through the front gate at 50 miles an hour with your V8 engine roaring? The SAS completely aggressively transformed into a highly mechanized pirate fleet, utilizing the sprawling, featureless desert exactly like an open, unforgiving ocean. They no longer tiptoed through the darkness, they violently weaponized it, completely changing the fundamental mathematics of the North African conflict and physically forcing the German High Command to constantly, agonizingly look over their shoulders. This completely revolutionary, highly mechanized doctrine meant the phantom operators could now violently materialize out of the pitch-black darkness, aggressively unleash a torrential, blinding hurricane of incendiary machine gun fire, and instantly, flawlessly vanish back into the suffocating abyss of the Sahara. The terrified, deeply disoriented Axis defenders would be left entirely paralyzed amidst the burning, completely destroyed remnants of their precious aircraft, completely unable to even chamber a round in their Mauser rifles before the ghosts had evaporated. This violent, highly mobile tactical paradigm completely shattered the psychological spine of the German rear guards, mathematically guaranteeing that every single Axis airstrip in North Africa was permanently, fundamentally vulnerable to apocalyptic destruction. The stage was now perfectly aggressively set for the absolute climax of Stirling's vision, a massive, heavily armed vehicle assault that would violently incinerate the sky and permanently cement the terrifying legend of the SAS. The absolute devastating pinnacle of this revolutionary vehicle-mounted tactical doctrine violently exploded into reality on the pitch-black night of July 26, 1942, at the sprawling, heavily guarded Axis airfield of Sidi Hanaish. First Lieutenant David Stirling personally commanded a massive, terrifying strike force of 18 highly modified Willys Jeeps, aggressively navigating over 50 miles of treacherous open desert by relying entirely on precise stellar navigation. As the terrifying phantom columns silently approached the perimeter, the entire airfield was suddenly brilliantly illuminated as German ground crews switched on the runway lights for a returning bomber. This stroke of fate entirely, mathematically exposed, perfectly aligned rows of dozens of highly valuable Axis aircraft, offering Stirling a miraculous, once-in-a-war opportunity. Recognizing the absolute, cold-blooded potential for total destruction, Stirling aggressively fired a green flare into the night sky, violently unleashing the most destructive, deeply terrifying mechanized commando assault of the entire North African campaign. The 18 heavily armed jeeps violently charged directly onto the glowing tarmac in a massive, terrifying V formation, with their roaring V8 engines screaming across the concrete. Operating with an absolute synchronized precision, the percussive, deafening roar of over 70 Vickers K machine guns aggressively detonated simultaneously, violently filling the pitch-black sky with a blinding, apocalyptic web of glowing tracer rounds. The heavily loaded jeeps violently tore down the flight line at high speeds, their gunners systematically, ruthlessly emptying their 100-round drum clips into the fragile, fuel-laden fuselages of the parked bombers and fighters. The entire sprawling airfield was instantly, mathematically transformed into a suffocating, blinding inferno of exploding aviation fuel and completely shattered German steel, as the Phantom Raiders unleashed a torrential, unquenchable hurricane of fire that Rommel's defenders were entirely claustrophobically unable to stop. In a matter of just 15 terrifying, blood-soaked minutes, the heavily armed SAS column violently completed their devastating run and aggressively vanished back into the freezing desert night before a coordinated defense could even be mounted. They had mathematically inflicted catastrophic, unmitigated industrial damage upon the German war machine, claiming the violent destruction of nearly 40 enemy aircraft while suffering only one single, deeply tragic casualty during the assault proper. This raid proved that Stirling's vision of vehicle-mounted firepower was far more effective than the previous reliance on foot-borne sabotage with C4 plastic explosives, which had frequently suffered from damp fuses and technical failures. The sheer, terrifying scale of the destruction at Sidi Hanaish sent an absolute paralyzing shockwave through the highest, most heavily fortified echelons of the Nazi regime, proving that no rear-area target was truly safe. The catastrophic, undeniable success of the SAS Phantom raids violently pushed Adolf Hitler into a state of absolute psychopathic rage as he watched his vaunted Luftwaffe being systematically decimated on the ground. deeply humiliated that a tiny rogue unit of misfits driving modified American vehicles with V8 engines was mathematically paralyzing his North African campaign, the Führer personally aggressively issued the highly classified Commando Order. This cold-blooded, mathematically horrific directive explicitly mandated that any Allied commando captured behind German lines was to be immediately, ruthlessly executed without a trial, regardless of whether they were wearing proper military uniforms or attempting to honorably surrender. This terrifying, blood-soaked escalation physically proved the absolute strategic genius of First Lieutenant Stirling's doctrine, as the massive, mechanized fascist empire was now so profoundly terrified of the SAS that they willingly, violently shattered the international laws of armed conflict just to desperately try and stop them. Despite the terrifying threat of the Commando Order, the SAS operators aggressively continued their campaign of mechanized terror, knowing they had permanently altered the mathematics of the war. Every burning Junkers on the desert floor was a testament to the absolute failure of the Axis to secure their own rear echelons against the phantom threat. The brilliant, chaotic marriage of American industrial manufacturing and British unconventional ingenuity had birthed a monster that Rommel simply could not kill. As the smoke cleared from the ruins of Sidi Hanesh, the legend of the Phantom Major was permanently, violently cemented in the annals of military history, setting the stage for a legacy that would survive long after Stirling himself was eventually removed from the battlefield. The desert was no longer just a landscape of sand and heat. It had become a hunting ground where the ghosts of L Detachment reigned supreme, ruthlessly executing their cold-blooded mission until the very end. The brilliant, deeply audacious personal war of First Lieutenant David Stirling violently, permanently concluded in the freezing, highly contested winter of January 1943 in southern Tunisia. While aggressively leading a raiding party deep into enemy territory, attempting to become the first Allied unit to link up with forces advancing from the west, Stirling's Phantom unit was finally, mathematically cornered by overwhelming German patrols. Despite executing a desperate, chaotic evasion across the dunes, the legendary Phantom Major was violently captured, ending his sprawling, devastating tenure as the active commander in the desert. Unwilling to silently accept his deeply humiliating captivity, Stirling ruthlessly engineered at least 4 highly elaborate escape attempts, forcing the frustrated German High Command to permanently lock him inside the supposedly escape-proof, heavily fortified walls of Colditz Castle. Even behind bars, his rebellious spirit remained entirely unbroken as he spent the remainder of the war serving as the chief of the escape committee, planning the very breaks that would continue to humiliate his captors from within. With their visionary founder violently removed from the geopolitical chessboard, the fossilized critics within the British military establishment gleefully assumed the SAS would finally, mathematically collapse without Stirling's aristocratic influence. But they entirely, catastrophically underestimated the terrifying, blood-soaked foundation that Stirling, Jock Lewes and Paddy Mayne had meticulously built in the Cabrit camp. Paddy Mayne aggressively seized total, unmitigated command of the unit on January 27, 1943, brutally and efficiently leading the heavily armed Phantom Raiders through the violent invasions of Sicily and Italy. Under Mayne's ruthless leadership, the unit proved that it was no longer just an experimental detachment, but a permanent and terrifying fixture of modern warfare. By the time the North African campaign officially concluded, the SAS had already been granted full regimental status, the ultimate undeniable vindication for a unit that had started with 66 men and a stolen piano. The monumental, heavily romanticized legacy of the North African campaign absolutely and fundamentally redefined the entire modern concept of special operations. The terrifying, mechanized ghosts who aggressively charged onto the burning tarmac of Sidi Hanesh with their roaring V8 engines and Vickers K drum clips mathematically proved that a microscopic force could inflict strategic-level damage. The ingenious, highly lethal marriage of surplus British machine guns and the durable American Willys Jeep completely and permanently transformed the physical landscape of hit-and-run warfare. This brutal, blood-soaked blueprint provided the foundation for every single elite Tier 1 unit operating in the world today, from the US Navy SEALs to Delta Force, all of whom trace their spiritual and tactical lineage directly back to the rebellious Scottish aristocrat who refused to follow the rules. Today, the sprawling, sun-scorched abyss of the North African desert has long since violently swallowed the rusted, shattered remnants of the burned-out Stukas and the empty brass casings of the Vickers guns, but the terrifying, undeniable echo of the SAS remains immortalized. They were a brilliant, chaotic band of fiercely independent misfits who aggressively refused to play by the mathematically fossilized rules of total war, ultimately forging the most legendary, highly feared brotherhood of silent killers the world has ever seen. However, a dark, suffocating question still haunts the historical record. Was the SAS truly the architect of its own success, or were they merely the beneficiaries of the LRDG's superior knowledge? The debate over who truly won the Desert War, the raiding ghosts or the navigators who carried them, continues to rage among historians and veterans alike, serving as a permanent reminder that in the desert, no one survives alone. Who do you think deserves the ultimate credit for the survival of the early SAS? The brilliant, aggressive vision of First Lieutenant David Stirling, or the massive, reliable Chevy trucks of the long-range desert group that physically carried them through the abyss? Was the American V8 Jeep the true hero of the desert, or was the Phantom unit just lucky that Rommel's airfields were so poorly guarded? The reality of the SAS is far more complex than the myths suggest, and the truth remains buried beneath the shifting sands of the Sahara. Drop your explosive historical debate down in the comments below, hit that subscribe button to join our relentless pursuit of WW2 secrets, and I will see you in the next dark chapter of history.